Welcome. I'm Dr. Emily Helder, and I'm here with Dr. Peter Selman, who's a visiting fellow in the School of Geography, Politics, and Sociology at Newcastle University, where he was the head of the Department of Social Policy until his retirement. He's also the author of a chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Adoption entitled Adoption in the Context of Natural Disaster. So thanks so much, Peter, for being here. So I wanted to ask you some questions about your chapter. It begins by outlining some of the macro level factors, politics, economic factors that impact adoption in a variety of ways. And then you also outline some of the changes and trends in adoption in terms of the peak in the early 2000s in the number of international adoptions and the changes over time in different sending countries. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about how some examples of those structural factors that have impacted the number of kids that have come, where they're coming from.
Yes, I mean, I think if I go back to the early 1990s when the Hague Convention was introduced, people had thought that inter-country adoption was coming to an end, apart from a quick surge with Romania. And then it all changed and it went up solidly until 2004. And the rise was largely due to two countries, China and Russia. And many people thought that would just go on forever. And then dramatically in 2004, it changed and down. And since then, every year, the numbers have been lower. And it's got to a point now where the level is lower than it was in the 1970s. So it's gone right down. So it's the lowest for a long time. And many people see this as being the curse of the end. And of course, with this year of pandemic, we just don't know what's going to happen in 2020, 2021. But I think that it's not certainly going to go up.
Right.
And the changes, I mean, briefly, you asked me about countries. The most dramatic changes are that the two big countries, China and Russia, have both started to go down. China, very steadily, but now leveling off at about 2,000 a year, from a peak of about 14,000 a year. Russia's gone down, and due to clashes with the US over adoption, is down below 1,000 a year. Two other countries perhaps worth mentioning. One was Guatemala, which at one stage was for a small country, it had a huge number of children, almost entirely the United States. And then stories of corruption came out and all sorts of bad things. And so both sides agreed to close down. And Guatemala now, we're talking, instead of the 4,000 or 5,000 that you had in the 2000 to 4 or 5 period, you're now down to 2 or 3 a year almost. And finally, we had an extraordinary period of a surge in African countries. Some people would say this is just the market as the other countries went down. Where do we go next? Africa. And so the African numbers as a continent went up solidly right the way through until about 2010. And people thought that would go on. And then things began to go wrong. We found there was corruption in Africa, and those numbers came down. And so Africa's having gone up lazily while everybody else is coming down, is now coming down. And so 2009, 6,500 to Africa, now very small numbers, especially in some countries which are more or less stopped. So that's the broad story.
Yeah. Well, and we have a chapter too in the handbook about adoption from Ethiopia and how they've made that transition to developing more domestic adoption programs. So it seems like there's a variety of things contributing.
Now officially called an end to international adoption, but it's too early to see whether that's going to happen. I think it will, but the numbers are right down. And at one stage, African adoption was more or less Ethiopian adoption, because Ethiopia has started to send children way back. You go right back to the 1980s and 70s. And the only African country sending children was Ethiopia, initially mainly to Sweden.
Yeah.
And of course, Ethiopia is unusual in that it's one of the few African countries that was never colonized.
Right. Yeah. So it really illustrates the numbers of the ways that the political, economic, bigger factors.
And you look at some countries that were surging 10 years ago, like Uganda, right down. Some have been more steady, like South Africa, that's continued much the same. But in Africa, some of them are Mali, for example, now 1 or 2 a year. And a lot of this, sadly, is to do with the recognition of the bad things that were happening. And the bad things were more the fault of the West than of Africa.
Yeah, well, and I want to ask you about that too as we keep going. One of the next things that your chapter focuses on is adoption in the context of humanitarian crises, especially natural disasters. And you have an interesting section in there about media portrayals. And I was curious if you could reflect a bit on some examples of how media portrayals of the crisis have impacted adoption in the midst of those crises.
It's always quite difficult, this, because media has expanded so much over the last 30 or 40 years. So in a way, if you think of the big crises, if you go right back and look at Ethiopia, for example, in the 1980s, the famine, media was not big then. And the Americans were not involved, so they weren't interested. And so the Ethiopian famine was covered in the media, but largely as a problem of starvation and sending aid. And we had Live Aid and all these things. The issue of adoption just is not there. The issue of children needing to be adopted was not there. That was absent. So if you go back as far as that, adoption is not part of the story. You could argue that before that, in Korea and Vietnam, it was. And those are two countries that were highly involved with the States. And the Americans in Vietnam, of course, the getting people out of Vietnam was so important. And so there was a huge coverage of the crisis of the Vietnamese orphans, most of whom were mixed race. They were the product of GIs. And so there was a lot of publicity there, and rescue began to be a word to be used in Vietnam especially, but it had been earlier in Korea as well. But there's still some very dramatic footage available of Vietnam, and it includes the terrible story of the helicopter that was taking a couple of hundred Vietnamese orphans and crashed. So the baby lift, it was very well covered. More recently, I suppose the first thing that comes to mind, if you go back to the 1990s, when China had just opened, about 1991, it opened up to international adoption. And the BBC ran a program called The Dying Rooms that was then widely seen all over the world. And it portrayed this dreadful picture of orphanages where Chinese children were sent to die. And so that was big story. And that, I think, certainly triggered a feeling of humanitarian. If we could only take these children, their lives would be saved. And I think that had a big impact. So that would be one example. Later on, we have obviously later on Haiti had huge coverage. And that certainly, especially in the States, because Haiti is so close, triggered off a huge amount of interest. And there's lots of stories which I've mentioned in the chapter of people going to rescue children from Haiti. And the picture was of, this poor country shattered by an earthquake, and there were orphans, in inverted commas, on the streets waiting to be picked up and saved. And so you had rescue missions from Methodists and from other evangelical groups, and indeed from state governors sending over planes to take these children home to safety. In between that, you have an interesting example of another widely covered episode, and that was the Asian tsunami. And that was very widely publicized. It came just after Christmas, and there are pictures of horrendous pictures of this terrible floods. What was interesting there was that certainly triggered interest in rescue, but the countries involved, together with America, all came out with a message alongside this disaster picture, saying, we don't plan to take these children, we plan to help them. And so a very different message in the middle there. So there's a few examples of things that got really, really big stories. And there's lots of others, but those would be some examples of how media sparked in the ordinary person, especially in America, I want to help.
Sure. Well, and I want to pick up on a few threads that you just mentioned. So in your chapter as well, you talk about this idea of adoption as rescue. And I wondered if you could compare that approach or that idea with maybe more general, altruistic motivations that are endorsed by a number of both foster and adoptive parents. How are those things the same? How are they different?
It's in a way such a dramatic word.
Mm-hmm.
One writer, Sarah Dorrow, argues that it's used most strikingly for international adoption. In other words, rescue is not something that we use much in domestic adoption. If you put in domestic adoption and rescue, it's all about dogs, right? So
Yeah.
it's not about children. But with overseas adoption, it was a case of these poor countries, and especially with the strengthening of the evangelical Christian movement, these poor heathen countries. Mm-hmm. So rescue was partly back to almost a missionary zeal, that we were going to save these children from certain death, but also from living in a heathen country. So there was a double blessing. Mm-hmm. So you got very much caught up with the religious thing. But the theme was it was humanitarian rescue. It was saving children from China, from all these other countries. And it was in a sense, saying that the parents, therefore, were saviors. So the rescue thing was glossing over the fact that many of them desperately wanted children, that they were there mainly not because they wanted children, but because they wanted to help children. And that was something which had long been wiped out of the theme of domestic adoption, where domestic adoption always had more people wanting children than there were children available. So I think those were the themes. But the word rescue, and orphan rescue especially, came in really quite early in the post-war period, and then it kept resurfacing. And I went to a conference in Malibu at the Pepperdine University, which was entitled Intercountry Adoption, Orphan Rescue or Child Trafficking. Mm. And there it juxtaposed the two, but orphan rescue was the good side. And this was in the highly religious university. For others, orphan rescue was a bad thing and equated almost with child trafficking. But the clash between orphan rescue and child trafficking was an attempt to try and say, let's look at what is good and what we're doing. And therefore, in that sense, orphan rescue became a good term. But it's a difficult issue. And in a recent book, I think you have to show you this.
Yeah, please.
This is called Saving International Adoption. And this is by two supporters of how do we stop this dreadful decline when there are so many orphans out there waiting to be saved. And they talk about the savior complex and how this was part of the story. And in a positive sense, that this was people who are showing the good side of American nature. They were going out to help these children. Maybe they wanted them as well, but no, it was mainly about helping. And so I think that's interesting. And as I said, the rescue narrative is something that you find in the adoptions from Korea and Vietnam, later from Romania, which we sometimes forget, it comes in the middle. But when Ceausescu was deposed, the orphanages were full because he'd had a pro-natalist policy. And so there were so many more children that could be looked after who were put into orphanages. And again, there are stories of people, in this case from Europe, perhaps rather more than from America, going to Romania to try and make sure that they could rescue these children from these dreadful orphanages, because they were there, it was a poor country, and the orphanages were were hellholes. But then they found, when they went there, that the orphanages actually, the children were older, disabled. And so they went into the streets of Romania, and there they found gypsies, and there they bought children who were healthy and young outside the orphanages. So all that went into a rather terrible. But again, the theme was to rescue. And what nobody seemed to grasp at first was that if it had been the other way around, the idea of a Romanian coming to UK or to USA to save a child, outrageous. And we even had a terrible story of a couple who put their bought adopted children into the boot of their car and drove out from Bucharest. And they were stopped by the Romanian police and put into prison, stealing a child. And the British press had headlines out there, outrageous, here are good Brits trying to save these children and they've been locked up. And somebody did say, I think it was probably one of the more respectable Guardian type papers, said, well, what would we say if a Romanian was found leaving the UK with a British child in the boot? But that was an extreme case. So, yes, I mean, this is, the rescue word perhaps is overused, but it was partly a case of genuine dual motivation. And in the case of the evangelical movement, it became a bit more than that, that people, if you go back to the beginning of American adoption, Harry Holt, he was a fundamentalist Christian, and he and his wife went to Korea and they took, but adopted half a dozen children, not just one, and that became a model of what could be done. And they were good for doing that. And now we think, you're going in, taking 6 children you've never seen before and bringing them back. But that became part of the story of the Korean adoptions in the early years. And what was less talked about was that most of those adoptions were mixed-race children. They were the product of GIs. By the time you got into a decade later, there were no mixed-race children. The Koreans had seen that there was a market for children, and the children that were being sent were not the children of GIs, the war was over. They were the children of unmarried mothers in a country that stigmatized them and gave them no support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like, well, just the background of it is adoption is complicated. But I think it sounds like sometimes that adoption as rescue narrative maybe papers over some illegal or unethical practices, as well as maybe creates a narrative where adoptees are required to be grateful. And
good narrative, but it does, as you say, then this idea of grateful and of the adopter as the good man or the good woman, good couple who are rescuing children, and they should be eternally grateful. And this became more and more of a problem as we moved into countries like Africa, where there was no concept of Western adoption. And so you would be happy to send your child to America to get an education, and then they would come back. You'd be happy for them to be adopted by rich Americans, because then they would bring money back. The idea that those children were now no longer yours, you had no rights, or indeed the thought that those children might decide that the good life in America was so good that to go back to African hut was not attractive, it was more difficult.
Yeah. I'm curious too, because you've been involved with the Hague Convention, how do you see the Hague Convention serving as a safeguard against some of the practices that you've just outlined, trafficking?
Yes, I mean, the Hague Convention was built on some pretty bad things happening in the 1980s. And I know many people involved, and the Hague is desperately trying to lay down rules and to try and establish a pattern that makes adoption a good thing, but builds in safeguards. And if you look back to the 1980s, I mean, there were children being adopted from Sri Lanka, for example, to Sweden, to the Netherlands, and to the UK. all under 6 months. Very, very unclear the details, but one suspects a lot of money hanging, and there was no regulation. So what The Hague does is to try and bring in some regulation, given that already there's the basis of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which should stress the importance of the child's centre. But The Hague allowed more role for adoption if properly managed. And what they asked for was for every country to establish a central authority that would oversee things, and for more what they call accredited bodies or agencies that would be very carefully vetted and would follow certain rules. And at the heart of that was that subsidiarity. You only adopted children who could not be placed with friends or family in their own country. And that's been a constant question as to whether that's been achieved. But I think The Hague was very well intentioned. I still believe in The Hague very much. And I think it's trying to do its best, but it is not a legal framework. We've got no powers to enforce things. It depends on people ratifying the convention. And while most of the leading countries who receive children have done that, some did it very late. So 2008, I think, in the United States, even later in Ireland. But most of them have. But if you look at the countries that from which the children come, there are many that haven't. China has. And I still remember going to a meeting of The Hague when the Chinese announced this, and they did it before the Americans. And they didn't tell anyone, and the Americans were furious. And I'm so proud. We have ratified before the United States. But the other side of things are there are many others that haven't. Russia had, Guatemala did belatedly, but there are many countries in Africa that have got no contact and therefore are not strictly subject to it. And what happens in the United States is that different standards are applied to adoptions from what we call a Hague country. So if you're adopting from South Africa, you have different standards than if you're adopting from Ethiopia, where Hague has not been ratified. So it's a struggle, but if I end, so I'm going on too long, if I end on a positive note, the thing to recognize about the Hague Convention on the Rights of the Child is that it's important, it's been ratified by more countries around the world than any other Hague Convention. And it has been ratified by the United States, which was essential. If the States hadn't done it, it would have been. And remember, as I'm sure you know, the United States has not ratified the Rights of the Child. So yes. US and Somalia are the only two countries not to recognize that. So it's quite a significant achievement to have brought so many countries together and to virtually have all the countries to which the children go. I think there are a few exceptions like United Arab Emirates, but all the big countries have ratified and are in principle adhering to practice. And there's a special commission every 4 or 5 years when the two sides come together, and that's such a moving thing. And they're all are equal. You are put in an alphabetical order, not rich countries, poor countries, not sending, receiving, it is all alphabetical. And I was marvelous. So I'm a great fan of The Hague. It needs more powers, but the fact is that they designed a set of rules which have lasted since 1993. And for the most part, I think they're good rules. They need to be, and they're polished all the time, but they haven't ever changed the structure. It's just a matter of clarifying what they mean.
Yeah. As an expert in adoption policy, as you kind of look at the full system, how do you think about balancing some of the tensions? So I'm thinking in particular, there's an urgency to making sure that children are raised in family-based care. We know institutions are bad for kids, and so we really want them in family-based care as soon as possible. but then on the other side, as a tension, you really, like you've said, need an ethical, legal, international child welfare practice, and you want to prioritize family preservation and reunification. So, do you see some ways that those tensions can be balanced well with policy? Do you think The Hague tries to do that? Do you have, other things that you wish were in place?
I think it's difficult. I mean, I do remember my dear friend René Hochsbergen from the Netherlands, who's written many books and many studies on adoption, ending one chapter by saying, isn't it sad that we still live in a time when the only way in which some children can be helped is by sending them thousands of miles away from their home country to look after somebody else. So, I mean, his view was that, yes, we need it, but it would be not a bad thing if international adoption were to gradually fade out. And of course, some critics like David Smolin have said that it's a thing from the past, it's a sign of empire and all these bad things, and that sooner or later it will stop. And then we will look back and say, well, why on earth do we do that? And this rings a bell in my country, the UK, which there's very little adoption abroad, and because we sent many children to Canada, to New Zealand, to Australia, we call them the child migrants. And this went on until 1960s. And I started working in childcare at that time. I didn't know this was going on. Nobody did. And then they started to come back, and constant cry. They were not sent for adoption. They were just sent to a better life, working on farms in Australia, and many were exploited. It was almost like slave labor. And so we look back and think, that was a terrible mistake. How on earth did we go on doing that for 100 years? But at the time, you have to understand that it seemed to be a good thing. It was a way of getting children away from the poor laws. There were great hopes, and for the minority, it was a great success. So I think there's always a sort of a problem that we see things still through the eyes of the receiving states. And I remember going to a meeting in Washington of the Holt organization, and there was somebody there who had a special session that we were all invited to, early morning, lovely breakfast, and they told us how we must save international adoption by stopping all this whinging on about Haiti, and stop all this negativity and get on with it. And I still remember we must stop the end of international adoption. And then one of the delegates, I think it was from Nigeria or something like that, stood up and said, if it stops, it is we who must make the judgment. We decide whether you have our children. It's not for you to decide. And I thought that summed up something very important, that the difference of power and the importance of the voice of the standing countries. And of course, that's what's happened now that with China. China is in charge. China could stop tomorrow if it wanted to. It doesn't, because it does quite well. We're sending largely older children who will be very costly to look after themselves, to a place where they know that they will be well looked after, and where there's much better medical facilities. But that will change. But the idea of the abandoned baby of China, little babies, beautiful babies, healthy babies, that was so attractive in the early 2000s, that's gone. And they're in charge. And likewise, the Russians, I don't know whether it was Putin, but the realization that the best way to hit at America was to stop adoption to America. Mm-hmm. But that was because people from America had murdered Russian children who didn't please them. And on one occasion, one was sent back to Russia. He wasn't good enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I remember that distinctly. That was early on in my career. So I remember that specific incident in particular. Yeah, I wonder, as you're reflecting on kind of the roles of both the sending and receiving countries, what roles and responsibilities do you see for Western nations like the US or the UK in terms of reducing or preventing the proliferation of orphanages and institutional care, preventing child trafficking within the countries that have historically been those sending countries? So you said, you know, the sending countries we have to honor their voice. And of course, what role do the Western nations have?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very, very interesting question. I mean, when it comes to China, China's in charge, so China will decide. But when it comes to Africa, it's a very different story. And you mentioned orphanages. I mean, the story of Africa is of Western, mainly US-funded orphanages. And the word orphan is so striking. In America, I think they have dropped it to now, but for many, many years, you granted an orphan visa, even if somebody had got living parents. And so orphan covered not somebody who's a full orphan, having lost both children, but those who only had one parent, and those who, for whatever reason, had been taken away from their parents. So that, and there was a similar, I think it was in Nepal, they had a similar situation where International Social Service produced a wonderful film called Paper Orphans. So, I mean, one thing is this sort of ability to actually see who really needs help, and to stop going around in circles by funding orphanages with a lot of money, in return for which you expect them to send some children for adoption. It's never spelled out like that, it's not a contract. But there's no doubt that in Africa especially, and it was very striking, I think, in Uganda, that many of the orphanages were used by locals because it was the only way in which they could get their children safe and an education. They were not orphans, but they went to the orphanages. And you had similar things that happened in Romania earlier. And I think that situations like that have now become apparent, and that's why Uganda has stopped. And if I stop going on to the one country in Africa I know quite well is Ethiopia. And Ethiopia has got the whole range. There are orphanages there that are set up with a view to getting children and sending them back for adoption. There are other orphanages that are run by voluntary groups like SOS, where they set up villages, half of which are local orphans, half of which are open places for locals to send their children to school. So the orphanages got computers, which the villages haven't got. And so they share the facilities with the locals. And that should be a very good model. And then I was lucky enough to come across an institution funded by an American philanthropist that was set up for grandparents. And this absolutely wowed me. I went there, and it was a day center, it was day only. And all the children who came were AIDS orphans. This was in the peak of the AIDS epidemic. And they were all, had lost their parents, but they were looked up by their grandparents. And so this woman has set up an institution that provided free education, nursery education, on a day basis to take the pressure off the grandparents. And that was absolutely nothing. They got very good education, grandparents got a bit of spare time. But then, when they'd gone through that stage of education, they went back to the grandparents with funding that enabled the grandparents to continue to offer them education in different places. And that was such a marvelous model as an alternative to what you could do as a philanthropist, rather than just sitting at an orphanage. So there's a huge amount of question there. I mean, the importance of American funding for Africa is huge. You can't deny the good that the philanthropists done. And a lot of this in well-organized international adoption has been also very good. But it's a question of a balance.
Yeah, I appreciate the ways that you're talking through balancing some of those tensions and those ideas. I think, you know, you're right. I've seen that same thing where adoption can be permanency and love and belonging and be such a good fit, and at the same time there can be ethical practices and family practices that don't result in the best outcomes for children. So yeah, it's a challenging issue.
I feel this very strongly as one of the few countries outside the United States which continues to do domestic adoption. And these are questions, most of my European colleagues think we shouldn't be doing this. And yet they're beginning to see that there is a limit to saying no to domestic adoption, because for some children, they come from families that are ridden by alcohol and drug problems. They're never going to get a good life. And well-organized domestic adoption, and I think the domestic adoption is very well organized in the States, this offers a tremendous hope. But of course, then you come back to the race issue and the question in America of should white families take Afro-American children, and the question of whether they want Afro-American children when they could get a Chinese child or a genuine African child. It gets very complicated.
It does. It does. We have a couple interviews coming up with individuals who've written chapters in the handbook about transracial adoption. So I think that will be really valuable to add to that context.
It is. I mean, well, you know, you've gone through so many stages of how to handle transracial adoption, and it's a difficult one because there's no doubt that, especially when I'm looking at following the election and so on, there's a big problem of assuming that transracial adoption is a good thing or assuming it's a bad thing. Assume it's a good thing, and then having to recognize it's a one-way system. That you don't want your white children adopted by Black Americans. And then you begin to say, well, what's going on? And of course, the international adoption, again, is more complicated than the simple picture gives. In Britain, we have very few adoptions, but most of them are now by people who, they're not transracial intercountry adoptions. Some adoptions from Pakistan to the UK are by Pakistanis living in England. They're not relatives, but it's an adoption that's not transracial. It's cross-country, and I think that can be very important to recognise that there's all sorts of different types of intercountry adoption, and we not least we've got the issue of what happens with the Muslim countries where adoption is officially not allowed until you've got your father, and should you have that and allow it to be changed into adoption?
We could go on and on. Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you so much for your time in talking through some of these ideas with me, and of course, your work on the chapter. I think it's so valuable for readers to be able to see the ways that larger structural factors, political, economic, relationships between countries, even how that's all woven together with adoption. So thank you so much.
Well, I hope that that has covered a point. For the reader, I would say go back and have a look at the stories, especially of Haiti and the tsunami, and the difference between situations like that, because there's a world of interesting material on Haiti.
Yeah. We'll link the chapter so that folks can explore that in particular. So thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Emily.